The following lesson is linked to Learning Outcome 4, Language. It addresses the assessment standard that requires learners to use structurally sound sentences in a meaningful and functional manner. Learners should be able to use simple sentences appropriately and correctly and construct acceptable compound and complex sentences by using clauses, phrases, and conjunctions. Learners should also be able to recognize and use different sentence structures such as statements, questions, commands, and instructions with growing accuracy. Learners should also be able to create cohesion by using conjunctions or pronouns with growing accuracy.
Hello, welcome. I'm Nicola Shongwe. In our lessons on sentences, we've learned a lot about the different types of sentence. Now, it's one thing to be able to name the different sentence types, but the skill that will really help to improve your writing overall is being able to add sentence variety. So in this extension lesson, I'm going to show you how to use a variety of sentence types in your writing. So let's begin by looking at this paragraph from a learner's autobiography. I was born in the Eastern Cape. I lived with my parents. My mother died. I went to live with my grandmother. She is a strong and generous woman. There is a generation gap between us. We argue a lot. Can you see that this extract uses only simple sentences? Simple sentences make the paragraph easy to read and the information is easy to find, but it hardly makes for gripping or interesting writing. So let's change this paragraph now and make it more interesting by combining and using a larger variety of sentences. I was born in the Eastern Cape. I lived with my parents until my mother died and I went to live with my grandmother. She is a strong and generous woman, but there is a generation gap between us, so we argue a lot. You'll see that the information is still the same, yet now the writing flows well. Also, because the clauses are linked, we get a feel for the order in which events happened and also how causes led to effects. Let's analyze what we've done. What type of sentence is the first sentence an example of? I was born in the Eastern Cape. The first sentence is still a simple sentence. A simple sentence works well as it gives a brief introduction and sets the scene. The next type of sentence, I lived with my parents until my mother died and I went to live with my grandmother, is a compound complex sentence. It has two main clauses and a subordinate clause. Firstly, let's look for the two main clauses. And here they are. I lived with my parents and I went to live with my grandmother. And do you see here that we've linked what were our simple sentences with the words until and to show what happened first and what came after. There's also a subordinate clause in this sentence that tells us when the main clause happened. Until my mother died. It gives us more information about when the main clauses occurred. I lived with my parents until my mother died, and then I went to live with my grandmother. We'll talk more about subordinate clauses in the next lesson. Let's continue now. What type of sentence is the next one? She is a strong and generous woman, but there is a generation gap between us, so we argue a lot. Remember to look for the finite verb and the subject. This is also a compound complex sentence. It has two main clauses and a subordinate clause. The main clauses are, she is a strong and generous woman, and there is a generation gap between us. And we also have the subordinate clause, so we argue a lot. And notice how we've joined the two main clauses with the word but. By using the word but, the writer has been able to balance or contrast the ideas. On the one hand, my grandmother is a strong and generous woman, and on the other hand, there is a generation gap between us, and so we argue a lot. Now let's quickly recap what we've learned in this exercise. Using a variety of sentences adds interest to your writing, shows the progression of ideas, and gives additional information in the form of subordinate clauses. Using a variety of sentences is definitely a technique that you should adopt in your writing. However, you should aim to strike a balance so that you don't fall into the following trap. Avoid sentences that are too long. Learners and some academics and authors try to use long sentences in their writing because they believe it makes it more sophisticated. But if your sentences are too long and contain too much information, they can be difficult to follow. Let's look at this example. Many people are so afraid that they will throw away documents that they will later need that they hang on to every scrap of paper that they ever receive. This paper then builds up until they can't find the paper that they do need, even if they wanted to. Now, you might be able to follow what's going on with this very long sentence, but if it had been split up into separate sentences, the information would have been conveyed much more clearly. So let's try and fix it. Here's the first problem. This is what's known as the comma splice error. Do you remember what the comma splice error is? It's when two main ideas that could each stand on their own are joined or spliced by a comma. How could we fix this? Well, instead of putting the comma after receive, a full stop should have been used, so that the main ideas are separate. The writer has fallen into a common trap, believing that longer is better. But in this case, it just creates a sentence that is too long and rambling and that is complicated. The second half of this really long sentence deals with the results of the paper clutter. I'm sure you will agree that this is the next main idea, and so it should be in a new sentence, which is what we've done. So the passage is now much clearer and reads like this. Many people are so afraid that they will throw away documents that they will later need, that they hang on to every scrap of paper that they ever receive. This paper then builds up until they can't find the paper that they do need, even if they wanted to. We've now turned the original long, complicated sentence into two shorter sentences. The basic information is the same. However, it is now a lot more reader-friendly than the original complicated version. You don't want people to have to reread your sentences several times before they can work out what's going on. Also, I'm sure you'll agree that when you're studying, simpler sentences are much easier to recall than very long sentences crammed full of information. So let's summarize what we've been talking about. We've learned that it's good to use a variety of sentence types, but when you have a lot of information to convey, be wary of writing sentences that are too long. Very long sentences can be confusing, difficult to extract information from, and ambiguous. So how should you check your own writing? Read through it carefully, paying close attention to where the full stops occur. If your sentences are all very short, See if you can combine them, as we did in our first example, where we made a compound sentence with a subordinate clause from 3 separate simple sentences. I lived with my parents until my mother died, and I went to live with my grandmother. If you have a whole long paragraph that has only one sentence, see if you can split up the long sentence into a few more compact sentences, as we did in our last example, where we had to separate the main ideas and correct the comma splice error by making 2 sentences. Remember, as I've said before, practice makes perfect. Reading more will give you a good idea of how to add variety to your writing, and also you'll pick up how good writers combine ideas into more readable, interesting sentences. That's all I have for you today. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time.